Hi, everybody. I'm going to begin to share my screen with you and just want to express immense gratitude to Trinity, to Grace, for inviting us to be a part of this dialogue, and of course to Jen, who's been a great thought partner over the years. I'm also incredibly thrilled to be here with my friend and colleague and partner in this work, Bryan Lee. We've been working together, thinking together across different cities and converging. And so it's just a real big treat to be here with you, Bryan.
Yes, absolutely, Matt.
So we're going to begin just to give a sense of kind of what's going to be coming. I'm going to shift into the full screen, and hopefully all of the technology will cooperate as much as it does for all of your Zoom calls too, which means mostly working, I hope. What we want to do is give a sense of the moment that we're in, both by way of looking backwards at what has happened over the last decade, last several years that precipitates now, and what are the ways to look possibly ahead. And I think that, in one sense, this work is very intense. It is very important. It cuts right to the heart of the most important symbolic issues in a city about who we are, what values we uphold, and how we protect democracy. And at the same time, it is the power of creativity to find new approaches. If we want new outcomes for our monuments, we need new processes. We need to put behind it the impact, the power, the ingenuity to think about monuments as connected to all civic systems that we have. So we're going to give a brief overview. I'm going to speak a bit about Monument Lab's history. Bryan will speak a bit about Colloqate Design and paper monuments. And then we're going to do a little bit of an overview of what's happening around the country, and then a little bit of a wish list before we shift into our questions. So just to give a sense, Monument Lab, which is based in Philadelphia, we're a public art and history studio. We work with artists, municipal agencies, cultural organizations across the country, and now a bit about outside of US borders. We want to critically engage the monuments we've inherited and unearth the next generation of monuments. And I'll show you some glimpses of our work. The way that we do that is often building prototype monuments in public spaces with artists. And when I say prototype, it's a reminder that all monuments are prototypes. None are permanent. They require maintenance and mindsets to hold them up. And what we want to do is bring new ideas and work with artists, work with communities to help think about what are the ways that we would capture history. We know that history doesn't fit inside a statue. It's just one small slice of what is important about a city. And so we try to find other ways that are engaging, interactive, and are really thinking about the intersection of social justice and art as well. Because it's not enough to just say that your art is neutral, has nothing to do with the concerns of democracy. They have to be front lines for it. Here are some images, including one ADA accessible monument to draw attention to the process that it takes to get monumental status. And also for us, we define monument as a statement of power and presence in public. So that includes bronze and marble, but that also includes poetry, light, gatherings of people. If you have the time, the money, and the power to build a monument that's important to you and your community, you would do it. But if you don't have the time, the money, and the power, you gather next to a monument that exists to amplify your voice. And I think most recent protest movement in defense of Black lives and other movements have shown us the power of utilizing what is already in public space to make sure that you are showcasing your visions for democracy. We have artists and communities work in all different kind of ways, but at the center of our work is process. The information, the data about our monuments is something that we've left kind of largely uncovered. There are cultural heritage data sites. There is a Smithsonian data sets, but how do you map cultural memory? It doesn't really fit with a pin on the map. So what we try to do in addition to building artworks is have research projects. We ask questions in different cities and different neighborhoods as a way to gather not one answer, but a multitude of possibilities. And we share them in reports. Here are examples. We like our data on the back end to have all the technology of any other civic data. about education, about income, about housing. But we like to lower the barrier for entry and have people handwrite. We do the work of transcribing and analyzing and sharing it. And what we have found consistently in our work in Philadelphia, in Newark, in St. Louis, in Austin, Texas, and beyond, is that people have ideas already about monuments. They've been protesting them for years. They have been finding the fact that they have deep connection. They have relationships to them. Sometimes they don't even see them, but they have their other ideas about where history lives. And that's the goal of Monument Lab, to share that work before the flashpoints, but to really think about this as a past, present, and future project about monuments. Bryan, I'm going to stop here and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm gonna take us to a little bit about paper monuments and Colloqate. I first want to just again reiterate the appreciation for having us in this room and in this space, and Paul getting a chance to kind of vibe off of what you're talking about, but also the work that we've been doing together over the last 4 or 5 years. So it really is appreciated in large part. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the organization that we run, which is focused on racial, social, and cultural justice in public spaces. And so we mostly work on civic, communal, and cultural spaces. One of the projects, again, that as Paul mentioned, is paper monuments. And I just want to give you 2 quick narrative stories. One is that the idea of paper monuments is supposed to be a little bit dissonant for you, right? Like it's supposed to be carry a little bit of dissonance for you, because the idea of monuments is that people believe they are permanent, that the stories that are told through monuments hold and have a lasting kind of consideration. But in fact, as Paul mentioned, they are not permanent. They are ideologies that are embedded in land that represent a moment in time and are constantly changing by weather, by people, by the sheer forces of time. They shift, right? We often talk about the fact that the monuments in our cities retain the residue of our own histories and memories. And so not only do they stand for what they were originally put in place for, but we carry those stories with us. So here in New Orleans, again, Robert E. Lee was one of the largest monuments in the South. And people associated it not just with Robert E. Lee, but they associated that space with Mardi Gras and their family history and their ties. And so you're fighting more than just a compounding, oppressive, unjust history in the monument itself, but you're fighting people's notions of who they are in relationship to those spaces and places. And it's important to acknowledge both, but not to be both sides, right? Understanding what history actually tells. So I want to just kind of note that at the top and acknowledge that, all of these things have a dynamic that needs to be, a power dynamic that needs to be assessed from your position. And one of the ways to do that is to acknowledge precisely what it takes to put in a monument and to maintain it versus what it takes to pull that down, and the relationship between power and privilege that implies. And so the privilege of being able to put up a monument is often deeded to those who have connections, who can raise the money, and who can easily maneuver the kind of political systems. I know this in part because I ran the public art department here in New Orleans, and I was open to a whole world of those particular conversations. And I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of a story. My first day as the public art director in New Orleans, I got a call. I got a call from the Monumental Task Force, and they asked precisely what, can you take care and maintain the upkeep for New Orleans monuments? Don't have the funds to maintain them, and we would like to request that the Arts Council hold those spaces, right? This was one of the very first calls I received. What that said to me was 2 things. One is that the force of community members was substantial to remove these monuments. And we're talking about monuments to to the KKK, that essentially, or a version of the KKK called the White League here in New Orleans, that was dead center in our city at one point and then moved off center. But just to give you a sense of this, the expectation was that a city was required to maintain and hold on to those. It was so very easy for these monuments to be put in place and in the world. And the ask from those who want to hold and maintain that history, the privilege was that they could utilize the city systems to maintain and hold that story. That's a very different consideration than that of what it takes to remove those monuments. They become so embedded in that story that it takes a political maneuver at some points, which is what you saw in 2017, 2018 with Mayor Mitch Landrieu, which really was about invoking a public nuisance ordinance. And I say this to say there is the complications with bureaucracy that we all know and that we all have to deal with resonate throughout all of these processes. And so when we talk about systems tying, or symbols tying to systems, we have to recognize the procedural steps that make that happen and make that viable. And so in 2017, you saw Mayor Mitch Landrieu use the nuisance ordinance to remove our Confederate monuments. More recently, you've seen the, again, antagonistic version of this from the current president to maintain those monuments. And so there's always this power struggle that you're having to deal with, not because we want to maintain the narrative of those particular entities and the monuments, but as W.B. Du Bois said, people are not fighting for some abstract consideration of government. They are fighting for privilege and power. And so these monuments represent that privilege and power often, and we have to acknowledge that if we want to move any of this forward. So out of all of these conversations and all of this context, I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like when community members actually have a say in what the outputs are. And this is really where your opportunity is, because you as politicians, as executives, require and need the support of communities to move these things forward. You have so many people who have the stories embedded in them that want to be released into this world. Why not give them the opportunity for that voice to be heard? And so you saw a little bit about what Paul talked about, giving people the opportunity to speak in their voice to make that happen. We also did that here in New Orleans, and recognizing that full context meant that we had to imagine new ways for monuments to exist within our city. And so that's what we did. We went about setting up a framework that included authors across the city, that included our artists in the city at all scales: two-dimensional artists, three-dimensional artists, visual artists, performance artists, all of them in this process. And again, I often talk about the fact that, architecture is the hardware to the software of kind of politics or society, and art is the user interface. All right, it is the way that the layman understands all of the technical considerations of our physical space and our social world, our social realm. So we need artists to be able to express and articulate our stories in ways that go beyond data sheets and PowerPoints, right? And then lastly, we wanted to make sure that communities proper had their voice not just represented in sheets, but publicly represented back into the world. So it was a feedback loop and continues to be a feedback loop to this day. And so asking us to tell multiple stories, and herein lies the reason that we call this paper monuments. We started with just the basic premise that so many stories that define our cities get buried, in large part because the mythology that we hold about our cities is confined to a very few set of narratives. And when we expand those narratives, when we lift those narratives with contemporary art and storytelling, then it allows us to see the multitudes of people, places, events, and movements that shape us, because individuals do not do anything, right? Individuals move in collective. And so recognizing that you as executives, have to work with legislators, that you as executives work with your community to make things happen. You are not alone in this work. None of us are alone in this work. It makes us better as servants to our community, but also better as citizens writ large. So having those conversations, and one of the ways that happens is just simply recognizing and honoring these stories exists beyond the framework of the paper. I tell two quick stories about this because they, to me, symbolize what it means to be able to do this work. One is the Dorothy Mae Taylor story, which is dead center. You see this piece of art that we posted. This was one of our first pieces. We posted this in the world. Her family saw this picture posted on a building, took a picture of it, and sent it to their entire kind of extended family. They asked, is this okay? Are we okay with seeing our mother, our family member, our matriarch in the world in this fashion? The family said yes, and they proceeded to make t-shirts, and they now go to city council with these t-shirts on and continue to engage in the public process to honor their mother. That's huge, right? Like, this little thing connects to not just the individual, but it expands beyond this woman who helped to desegregate Mardi Gras, not in 1970, but in 1992, right? Like, it's important to tell these stories beyond the context of just a monument, right? We want to expand the ways in which these narratives can be told. The other I also tell is around the Desire standoff, where the state governor used the police force to attack the Black Panther Party here in New Orleans in September of 1970. There were children, and it was a free food program for students in that neighborhood at the time. They shot 200 plus bullets through this house. One of the kids that was there that day crawled out the back, and he ended up, living a long life and became a worker for the downtown development district and was cleaning some of the streets. He saw this poster in large format on the streets and started to tear up a little bit. He eventually spent every day for the next 3 months as a docent, talking to community members as they got off of the bus to tell them about the story, to lock in a history that is often buried by way of us representing and holding high and lionizing stories that did harm to people, right? And so recognizing where stories lie to the most marginalized in your cities is absolutely a value add to your community. And so that means that we have to restore the complexity of our stories. That means that we have to leverage our systems, whether that's transit, whether that's civic spaces, whether that's our arts and cultural community. That means that we have to tell those stories in broad fashions. That means acknowledging folks from the young 8, 9, 10-year-old and their story of place, their kind of spatial imaginary, to those with a little more age who can tell stories but feel a little bit more articulate via writing out the words, right? So giving people that space and recognizing family and culture and women and the myriad, the multiplicity of narratives that want to be told there. And then acknowledging the many ways that we can ease the systems that we have in place, whether it's through your public art programs, and recognizing that we can do this in dimensional forms to call attention to other issues in our city, use the art and design to tie back to those systems that we do see as derelict or not serving our communities in the best ways. We had a project that was Stumble Upons, that we're taking these art pieces, expanding them, putting them in frames, and putting them out into the world on derelict houses across our city, to talk about some of the affordable housing issues that we have, to talk about how culture sustains and maintains itself within community. And then giving people the opportunity to vision at a larger scale. And I say this to recognize the total scale, from paper to murals to monuments to memorials to museums. The idea of scaling what memory means to community is substantial. Putting that across the city, making sure that as we start to acknowledge and work with our artists, that we're telling stories of people in place specifically, and we're acknowledging that there are different modalities for how those things exist in the world. So I'm going to pass this back over to Paul, and we're going to wrap it up. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryan. Even when I know what's coming next in the slide, just hearing it and thinking about it as the work that's happening over the course of years and the project continues is just so powerful. Yeah. And what I want to do is kind of two things. Pick back up. Pardon me, I'll just do full screen. Is kind of take us to the present. So just to give a sense, Monument Lab was founded in 2012. And we worked with a lot of artists and students whose ears were to the ground and said that this is a reckoning that's coming when it comes to monuments. That we're seeing protest movements, we're seeing artist actions. And I think similarly with the work of Colloqate and Paper Monuments, that we've been saying, you know, for some time, we want you to listen to these coalitions of people. I think to be really clear, you could look at the newspaper or your phone any day and see a new headline. And just as an exercise, you know, we're clearly in this moment, we're asking what next, what now, what has happened and what will happen. And just a few overview points. One is that anytime we see a headline in the paper, to just assume and understand that there are years of activism, of art making, of communities coming together behind any headline, whether or not it's acknowledged. And I think one of the greatest things that a mayor can do is acknowledge, listen to, and understand that even if the greater population of a city or country is taking note in a flashpoint moment, to not gaslight the people who've been having the conversation, actually think of them as experts on the ground. You know, we, and our team, we have people who have advanced degrees and who speak to wonderful institutes like this one, but we really try to trust local knowledge from the neighborhood, from the block, and understand how people see their own city. And so just to give a sense, you're not alone if you're in a city that's thinking about monuments, and here's a map that NBC News had updated as of 2 weeks ago, and so it probably has changed. I think despite public kind of fascination with the toppled monument, which may be happening in your cities, the large majority of monuments that are coming down now or have been tagged to come down are through local ordinances, local voting. And so this is really a snapshot at what it means to civically engage at the very local, state, and national levels. And the fact that this is not one system of monuments. This is each community together, and then in aggregate, understanding who they are and who they want to be. And like any kind of, I mean, I think, well, one thing I want to say is that monuments occupy this dual space where they are seen as sacred, special, they have an aura to them, but they're also civic property. They're concrete, they're stone. And so how do we actually adjust our standpoint to understand them in that dual reality? If you have like most or many pieces of civic property, you may have the paperwork behind them to understand how this building or how this asset got there, but you may not. It may be actually best known by local lore or oral history. And so to just understand what you have inherited is part of the process. In Richmond, Virginia, as many of us know, there's a convergence of the federal, the state, and the local. Mayor LeVar Stoney stepped in on July 1st And while he had the backing of a statewide law that went into effect that local municipalities could decide the fate of their monuments, he, I think just I'm thinking about Bryan's notion of the ordinance in New Orleans, cited for public health reasons, that there were monuments that needed to not just be flashpoints. I think in this moment, in the Stonewall Jackson takedown and others on Monument Avenue, there's also a notion that these monuments are not neutral. They actually cause harm. And so to remove them from public space is a public health, a public safety, and a public art concern.
And can I add one note on this as well, as you say this, right, Paul? You know, it's so fascinating that you mention it, because, you know, this is a process. We sat with Mayor Stoney 3.5, 4 years ago, and started to begin this process as he was really starting to get into it. But it's a long process, and you have to sometimes look for the right moments to be able to do the right thing, and encouraging him to do so may have taken a little bit more time, but the opportunity to do what's right is always right. So
yeah, no, that's beautifully said. Thank you. And it's just a reminder that although the time scale of memory, it doesn't fit in a mayoral term limit. And yet a lot of the approaches that we've seen are aiming to fix things within the term limit. And that's a challenge that we can talk about. I wanted to also point out on Monument Avenue, a monument that has not been taken down, but has been entirely reimagined and revised, is the Robert E. Lee statue. And I went there a few weeks ago to see it for myself. This is a place of that's people powered. The circle has been renamed Marcus Davis Peter Circle in honor of an African-American man who was killed by local police several years ago. It is organized. There are groups of people who provide oversight, nourishment, who are documenting it, who are doing voter registration, but it's not an initiative of the city. The city has actually gotten out of the way at this point. And thinking about the profound images here of what it means to have a monument that was part of a white real estate development from the late 19th century and stood as this fact in the city. And to see how people must go there. They don't go there at this point in time because it's gone. They go there because it's a space to acknowledge the time it takes to heal. And it's really important to note, if you wiped Monument Avenue away this second and said, we're starting over, which I know there are some people, I've had some conversations people have said, we say, wait, hold up. It is important to have spaces to acknowledge. We can't just wipe it away and say there's a clean slate. If you had a toxic site in a city, you'd need to remediate it, right, before you build something anew on it. And can we think about our monuments in the same way? These projections are not coordinated by the city. They're a group of artists who have changed the way that we see Monument Avenue. In other cities, like in Newark, and this register may look familiar to you, that following Mayor Mariel Bowser in Washington, D.C., there have been these large street murals painted in yellow. It's a fascinating text. But what's really important to note is that this was not just an effort delivered from City Hall in the city of Newark. Mayor Ras Baraka coordinated with local arts organizations, individual artists, activist organizations, and was in close communication. Process mattered as much as outcome. And on top of that, also leveraged city funds to support artists, especially artists of color. And so thinking about these as statements, but also going along with policy and dollars to approach equity is important. And then finally, in Birmingham, Alabama, a long contested Confederate statue right in the middle of a prominent town square, activists went out and tried to topple this obelisk. And the mayor of the city stepped in and said, actually, I see you, let me finish the job tomorrow. And I think of this as a powerful moment of listening. This was not treated as an emergency only in the moment of its takedown. It was seen as a long-standing conversation. And there are groups like Paper Monuments, like Monument Lab, that work locally in Alabama who have been organizing around this, both around this site, but also the broader landscape, what stories are not being told. So as we close, Bryan and I wanted to have a kind of wish list to put out there. And I think in large part, as we're seeing, not just now, but over the last 5 years, the ways that mayors, city administrations, and local government has played a role. One of the biggest shifts, and this seems very philosophical, but it is also traceable in dollars and cents, is that there is no such thing as permanent public art. We talk about monuments as if they're permanent, but we know that they take maintenance and mindsets to keep up. If monuments were not cleaned, if monuments were not landscaped, you'd see something entirely different. They would fall away, they would break apart. And in fact, many monuments move around. So if we shift that reality and shift that in our wording, what happens? What opens up? And we have seen artists time and again help us understand the difference and the bridges between temporary and permanent. You can communicate across generation. You can have conversations that are complicated. We've done in our research, engaging hundreds of thousands of people in person and millions online. People know that monuments evolve and monuments are made to change. Leave room for grief and resilience. Sometimes we want to just move fast and cover something up. And I think we've seen time and again, even without official sites of memory, the people rise up. And frankly, we're in a moment of profound loss. And I could say that about COVID-19. I could say that about systemic racism, but I know many of you in your communities have had other kinds of tragedies, whether related to gun violence, other kinds of important moments, and people want to grieve. People want to move forward, but they need that space and they want to talk about that. And so how do we create spaces that are organic, that are meaningful, but that show presence and absence together? This is one of the big ones, to not try to rush to quote unquote fix the problem of a monument in other words, to make it go away. I said this, but this is something that we've seen in our research, that the mayoral term limit is a time where resources and energy can go in, but it's not always the term of repair, of growth, of listening. So rushing toward repair, listening, growing, and equity, it might be that you also address a problem. But this is the deep work, right? Is dealing with the wounds that are underneath the sites and monuments. There are no neutral public spaces. I really suggest reading a powerful piece by Bryan Lee on City Lab, talked about the design of public spaces. And to think about when we talk about all people being welcome, what does that really mean? And sadly, a lot of public spaces have been designed for white comfort and the policing of Black and brown bodies. And so I think just thinking about, we hear in the debate, like, let's find a museum for this monument, or let's find a different park. And it's not that those spaces are neutral. So what is the work that we're willing to invest in to heal and move forward? And then finally, connecting symbols and systems. Investing in art and artists it really has a high return, because we are used to being scrappy. We're used to working with what we have, but to also really knit together democracy. And in this moment where we really have to tend to the way that we connect, we don't have the same means, we don't have the same places, we don't have the same strategies. How do we understand the public symbols as connected to systems so that we can resource them, we can build them, and we can grow together in coalitions to make a new generation of monuments possible that reckon with the past and also see the best in the way that we connect and strive toward justice and democracy. Thank you.